No, I think before we talk about slavery in Africa, we should talk about slavery as an institution, as an international institution in the world, inasmuch as this is an old institution and it has affected all human society and has existed through the ages long before it touched the continent of Africa. And we should talk about it at least briefly in Greek society, in Roman society, in biblical society. And there existed a slavery before there was a slave trade. When we're talking about the Europeans and the Arabs, at this point you're talking about a slave trade.
I see.
See, in Greek and Roman slavery, there wasn't much of a slave trade. And there was a point when there was a slight slave exchange without much of a slave trade. Now, the European slave trade began when there was something for the slave to do. The Portuguese began to come down the coast of Africa around 1438. And when they took the first Africans out of Africa and took them to Portugal, these Africans were well dressed, and they took with them African trinkets and ornamentation. The King of Portugal thought they were visiting African royalty, gave them presents, and let them go home. So the concept of enslavement hadn't reached the mind of Europe at the time. So when you study the years between the Portuguese entry, 1438 and 1492, there was very little slave traffic because no one had found any massive work for the slave to do. Then you study the rehearsal for the slave trade on the island of Madeira in the Canaries, where they experimented with the raising of certain crops that they would later transfer to the New World. Now we find people trying to find massive work for the slave to do. But until the opening up of the New World and the failure of European labor, there was no massive slave trade because there was no massive need for large numbers of people to be enslaved. And another thing you need to take into consideration is that the European was no great respecter of Europeans. Poor classes of Europeans would have been enslaved had they worked out physically. But many of these Europeans, because they had been treated so poorly, did not hold up health-wise. And a factor that needs to be taken into consideration that whatever the conditions of the Africans were, they were physically pretty good specimens. Whatever they did not have, they did have enough to eat, enough to wear, and pretty good housing, because their bodies were very durable under these dreadful circumstances, while the Europeans died wholesale. So they experiment in using European labor, and they would have used European labor if they could have, did not work out. So there was no transfer of slaves of consequence in the interim years between the Portuguese entry until after 1492 in the scramble for land in the New World. Then an unfortunate incident happened in Africa itself. A misinterpretation of an African change of labor in an incident of servitude that was interpreted as slavery. Many Africans in skirmishes and in wars, when Africans captured in wars with other Africans, would make certain Africans work off a period of indenture as payment for having lost the war. Sometimes Africans would accumulate surplus labor, and not having more surplus labor than he could use, he would farm his labor off to other Africans who happened to need it.
You are talking about the African chiefs or the African kings?
African kings and chiefs. The word chiefs is not an African name. The British created the word in order to keep from referring to an African as a king, keep from equating them with European royalty. And we know that the word chief is really a word to downgrade the African royalty, to keep from equating them with European royalty. Actually, the word king is not also, it's also not an African word. The Africans never referred to the equivalent of king as king. They gave him a name equivalent to king, but the word king was not his name. Because the Africans had a name, like in ancient Egypt, the name was Pharaoh. It meant just as much, but the name actually was not king. The Ghanaians never referred to their king as king. Even today, the king, the head senior person in royalty is a Santahini.
Yes.
Just add the word hini, which means overall. And those under him add the word hini to the name of the particular ethnic group, and that becomes his name, like the Omanhini is the king of the Oman group. So, I mean, we've been so Europeanized. We think that we absolutely must use European words for things. All right, now, my main point here is that the need was created by the European scramble for land in the New World. At first, the contest was between Spain and Portugal, with the sanction of the Catholic Church. The church was the major authority in the Europe of that day. England had some difficulty with the church, and so therefore England was outside for the first 100, maybe almost for the first 150 years. And so England ran errands in the trade without being in the center of the trade.
Because England was outside the church.
England was outside of the Catholic Church. And it was not until England pulled completely away and established her authority with the Church of England then went into the trade under its own banner. Then England, angry because she had been kept out of this lucrative trade, literally took over the trade with no mercy and became the master of the trade. In the meantime, England discovered that Spain and Portugal had been playing politics with the Pope, and successful politics at that. And the success of these politics is that 1455, before New World discovery, Spain and Portugal had gone to the Pope over a dispute about lines of demarcation, and the Pope had said to both Spain and Portugal, you are both authorized to reduce to servitude all infidel people. In other words, if a person is not a Christian, you are authorized to enslave the person. But in the politics of the papetry, the Portuguese always got the best of the deal. They were better Catholic politicians. And the Pope eventually, when the discovery was that Spain was grabbing more of the world than Portugal, there was a treaty of Tordesillas. Pope had said, you take the East and you take the West, and you two good Catholic nations stop fighting among yourselves. And this was really as a result of Christopher Columbus grabbing. Christopher Columbus wasn't supposed to come to the New World. That was a violation of an agreement. But the Treaty of Tordesillas gave Portugal a big country called Brazil. Portugal, being so small, didn't have the money and the manpower to manage a country. And Portugal got lost in Brazil and dissipated so much energy in Brazil that colonial-wise, it couldn't move much further. Because, see, Portugal was already in West Africa. And the British, when the British came in, the British drove them out of West Africa. This is how the Portuguese got to the Congo. The Portuguese were in the Congo for 100 years. But the Congolese were so organized, they would push them out of the Congo. The Congolese themselves would push them out of the Congo. Then they went to Angola, where they faced this brilliant woman warrior, Nzinga. This pressure would push them further down, and they would end up in Mozambique and Angola after the defeat of Nzinga. They would move their colonies around to East Africa. They would establish in East Africa a country that they first called Zimbabwe, after the king, whose kingdom was 500 miles along the coast, 500 miles inland. And they called it the Kingdom of Zimbabwe. And they built a fortress to protect it called Fort Jesus, still in existence. Now, the Spanish and the Portuguese were well underway, but once the British came in with bigger ammunition, they would grab the lion's share, and they would manage the trade until they decided that the trade had reached a saturation point. And while the British did not outlaw slavery, they outlawed the traffic at sea. 1807.
the traffic among the shippers, among the nations that were trading. Spain,
This
Portugal,
brought on the War of 1812, British jealousy of the United States, mainly because the United States, a young nation, had produced a ship called the Yankee Clipper that had bypassed the British. It could move faster and cut the water, and instead of the United States getting their ships, getting their slaves from Britain, the big seller, and catching, they were bypassing the British and going directly to Africa and getting the slaves themselves. Now, in this country, slavery was not a Southern business. While the Southerner was the biggest buyer and user of slaves, in this country, slavery was basically a New England business. And it seems ironical that the abolitionists and the Quakers who fought against slavery came from New England. This is why the Southerner ultimately would call them a bunch of hypocrites. You sold me the slave, now you're becoming so pious and tell me I shouldn't have a slave. See, but within Africa itself, that was a great event that has been forgotten. Concurrent with the slave trade, and almost at the same time it began, in inner Africa, the last of the great African nation states had not died. Sangay still existed and would exist up until 1591, when it was invaded by Morocco. The Arab influence came from East Africa, from the island of Zanzibar. Now, the Arab influence came from what is now Kuwait and Oman. These East African Arabs, these Southern Western Asian Arabs, turned Zanzibar into one of the largest slave trading ports in the history. You want to know, where did these slaves go? Some of them went to Asia. Some of them were traded with the Portuguese. But the Arabs at a given time took up to 40 million Africans out of Africa.
The Arabs?
Yeah, and except for the energy and the manpower and the organization that the Arabs and the Arab slave trade drained out of Africa, Africa would have had enough energy and organization to resist the European slave trade. The Arab slave trade was one of the great tragedies in the history of Africa. And it is a tragedy equal to, if not surpassing, the European slave trade. When the Iranians who invaded India took over, they did not trust indigenous armies. So they began to use Africans as mercenary soldiers, and some of these soldiers were slaves. Some of them were just paid soldiers. Some of these Africans rose to high positions in the armies of India. Some of them were great generals. In fact, the river Ganges is named after an African general. That's not even an Indian name. There was an Indian named Clarke who became governor of Bengal. This is outlined so beautifully in a little book by Joseph Harris, former professor of history at the Howard University and former head of the history department, called The African Presence in Asia. That's another unexplored aspect of African history. And if you want to know the history of the Arab slave trade, you should study UNESCO documents 2, part of the many documents attendant to the rewriting of the history of Africa. And it gives you the documents dealing with slave trade in the Indian Ocean. Now, if you study the Nigerian woman, Madam Tenebu, who was in the trade for local consumption, and when she discovered that the people that she was capturing and using for local consumption were being taken out of Africa, not returned, she began a war on the trade and fought the trade to a standstill and fought all the kings in the business, including the king of then Abukudu. And this is well recorded. And part of the story that there was a man asking for her hand because her husband had been killed, asking for her hand in marriage. And she told him that she had a man's work to do and she was not a woman until she finished it. And her job, she considered to be, is to pull from the throne every king in the slave trade. And when the last one was no longer king, she turned to the man that had been asking for her hand in marriage and said, okay, I will marry you now. I'm a woman. Now I'm a woman. I finished the man's work, so now I'm a woman. Married and went to a place called Jos in Nigeria. But I think the slave trade or the conditions of servitude between Africans and Africans that a whole lot of people have interpreted as slavery, which wasn't slavery. And a lot of people have used it as an excuse for slavery. Need to be explained. Because these conditions of servitude existed as feudalism in Europe, between Europeans and Europeans, and were far worse. And were not called slavery. So now, I'm not justifying it. All servitude is bad, no matter who is doing it, no matter what the people are. There's no justification for any people using the labor of another people cheaply or for nothing.
The Arab slave trade was just as vicious as the English slave trade in Africa.
If not more so, but I'll tell you a difference. The Arabs were better businessmen. The Arabs didn't mutilate the slave, bang him around. The Arab knew that a slave with a broken leg didn't bring top dollar on the auction block.
So the Arabs sold the slaves to the Europeans, or? He
sold them to anybody who would buy them, but the Arabs sometimes took the slave into his household and sometimes if the slave had talent, the slave had upward mobility. The Arab was a shrewder businessman in the handling of the slave.
Dr. Clarke, I think we're out of time and we'll have to wrap it up. I thank you for coming. This has been a very, very interesting subject. I think we're just touched on the iceberg. I think there is so much to be discussed about on this. So I hope that maybe one day, one other time, we'll be able to talk more about this slave trade in Africa. I thank you very much for coming. This has been African Panorama.